In a grand gesture that signified the end of the Cold War, on November 9th, 1989, the infamous Berlin Wall dividing the Soviet East from the democratic West was torn down in an act of triumph over decades of oppressive governments. From its construction until its fall 28 years later, the wall stood as a blatant division of powers. Its presence created vast cultural differences between the East and West Germans, and set a state of uneasiness around foreign relations and policies. In this video, we will analyze the effects of the Berlin Wall on the East and West Germans, and explore why the US and other powerful countries refrained from taking a strong stance against the wall. Following the victory of the Allied nations over fascist Germany in 1945, the Allied leaders, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, agreed at the Yalta Conference to divide Germany and its capital city of Berlin into 4 different zones, with each under the control of one of the victorious powers, namely Great Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sought to keep Germany economically dependent and less of a potential threat to the communist superpower. However, Britain, France, and the United States believed that economic success was the best way to ensure Germany's rise as a democratic and peaceful nation. To promote such economic stimulation, Britain, France, and the US combined their respective zones into one, unified under a common currency, the Deutschmark. This capital-controlled region became known as West Germany. Stung by the West's intention to create a republic without Soviet input, the Soviet Union harassed the Allies in an attempt to drive them out of West Berlin. They kidnapped West Berliners and Allied visitors, created misinformation campaigns against the West, and with Stalin's approval, cordoned off West Berlin in an attempt to starve the city. The Soviet Union expected the Allies to back down, but instead President Truman and the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee enacted the Berlin Airlift. The two Allied powers dropped food and fuel into the western zones of Berlin. The airlift lasted 12 months before Stalin removed the blockade, and at its peak delivered more than 200,000 tons of cargo per month. This event was the closest the two sides ever got to war. For the next 41 years, the West and East were sharply divided between the communist-controlled Soviet Union and the democratic United States. The divisions in Berlin persuaded Western European nations to forge a security pact with the U.S. For the first time since the American Revolution, the United States entered into a peacetime military alliance known as NATO. Under NATO, 12 nations, including West Germany, agreed that an armed attack against one of them would be considered an attack against all. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact, an Eastern European military alliance that included Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. East Germany, established as an independent nation on October 7, 1949, about 6 months following the establishment of West Germany on May 24th, was run by a Soviet puppet government. As tensions rose between the communist East and democratic capitalist West, a curious phenomenon began to occur along the border between the East and West Germany. Between the end of the Soviet blockade in 1958 and 1958, nearly 3 million East Germans, mostly young, educated, and skilled laborers, fled to West Germany across the Berlin border. As the only border still open in the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Division proved a perfect escape route from communist rule. In 1961 alone, more than 200,000 East Germans defected. This brain drain created an incredible economic strain on East Germany. A solution was devised by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to close the border between the East and West Berlin. The order was issued by Walter Ulbricht, the puppet dictator of East Germany, on August 12, 1961. Overnight, thousands of East German soldiers guarded the border while workers constructed barbed wire fences. On August 13, 1961, East and West Berliners woke up to see their city divided in half. Streets, subway lines, bus lines, tram lines, canals, and rivers were divided. Family members and friends were separated by the wall. In some cases, children visiting their grandparents on the other side of the border were cut off from their own parents. Many East Germans ran through gaps in the fence or hopped over the barbed wire, realizing it was their last chance to reach the West. On the west side, crowds gathered along the border and demanded that the U.S. step in to halt the building of the wall, which clearly violated the Yalta Agreement. And why didn't they? The U.S. had a powerful global and had global power and advanced weaponry to stop the building of the Berlin Wall in its tracks. Its presence set back World War II efforts to free citizens from oppressive governments and violated multiple agreements. It seemed only natural for the U.S. to respond with brute force. But the growing fear of nuclear war brought on by the arms race kept the U.S. and NATO from responding with military force. In private, many political leaders were actually glad the wall had been built. It created stability in a highly conflicted area, even at the cost of freedom. Commanders of the U.S. troops in Berlin made plans to bulldoze the wall, but abandoned the idea after Soviet troops moved armored vehicles in to protect it. The West German government was furious with America's lack of action, but John F. Kennedy said in a speech that, quote, "A wall is a hell of a lot better than a war."
The Berlin Wall completely surrounded West Berlin, running for a total of 96 miles. Slowly, the wall evolved from a barbed wire fence into a 12 to 15-foot concrete wall, complete with guard towers and machine guns. Rows of coiled barbed wire created a 30 to 100-yard gap between the wall known as the Death Strip, where soldiers and tanks patrolled the area and landmines were strategically placed. But this did nothing to stop East Berliners from trying to escape to the west. It is estimated that 5,000 people safely escaped through the Berlin Wall. East Germans who fled to the west threw away their Eastern currencies once they reached the border. The welcome money given to East Germans' arrivals in the west had a powerful symbolic significance for those seeking freedom in the west. Some escapees dug tunnels under the wall. Other creative methods, such as the famed usage of a hot air balloon to fly over the wall, were not uncommon. But other escape attempts were especially suicidal. The Berlin Wall was the first properly televised world crisis, and viewers watched as East Berliners leapt from high windows and roofs in attempts to jump across the wall, and witnessed the deaths of nearly 200 citizens killed by the guards under shoot-to-kill orders while trying to escape. One of the most dramatic deaths was that of Peter Fetcher, who in 1962 was shot by border guards and left to bleed to death in broad daylight. Even pregnant women and children were shot to death. All this time, the U.S. did nothing. The wall caused many West Germans to completely forget about the East. The possibility of reunification seemed even more remote. Life on either side of the wall was very different. East Berlin appeared oppressed, while the West seemed democratic and free. West Berlin was thriving economically. Museums, shops, and movie theaters lined the main streets. In contrast, East Berlin was economically depressed, and most buildings were solitary and gray. After the wall was built, Western goods were no longer available in East Berlin and were very difficult to smuggle in. Only East German goods were allowed to be sold. East Berliners had few luxuries, and people were constantly taken in for questioning and often jailed if suspected of speaking out against the government. Checkpoint Charlie was a breach in the Berlin Wall that allowed members of NATO to enter East Berlin. In August 1961, East Germany began to demand identity documents from American officials entering East Berlin. Many Americans felt that this was a breach of the Potsdam Agreement. In response, they unleashed what was known as the Checkpoint Charlie confrontation, where Soviet and U.S. tanks sat armed at the border facing each other for nearly a day. This was the only time during the Cold War that American and Soviet tanks faced each other, but Kennedy pulled back his troops before any violence broke out. In an attempt to reassure the West Germans that the United States had not abandoned them, President John F. Kennedy traveled to the Berlin Wall in June 1963 and gave his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. This speech was met with conflicting viewpoints. Many Germans were upset that the U.S. was refusing to provide military support, but others claimed to have appreciated his sentiment. In German, the word Berliner can also refer to a jelly donut. Though the president's statement was technically correct, many West Germans, angered by Kennedy's lack of military support, mocked him by emphasizing a meaning he never intended. I am a jelly donut.
And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev took control of the Soviet Union. He instituted several policies in an attempt to stimulate economic reform, such as glasnost and perestroika, which allowed Soviet citizens to voice discontent with their governments. Gorbachev hoped to end the Soviet and U.S. nuclear rivalry and form stable foreign relations with the U.S. He negotiated with President Ronald Reagan to reduce both countries' weapons stockpiles. As foreign relations between the U.S. and the USSR loosened, Reagan took the opportunity to voice his strong opinion on the Berlin Wall. On June 12, 1987, Ronald Reagan gave an inspirational speech in which he demanded that Gorbachev tear down this wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Reagan's associates feared that the speech would be too provoking and aggressive sounding, but Reagan insisted that it was the right thing to do. A significant initiative Gorbachev implemented that led to the breakdown of the Berlin Wall was the Sinatra Doctrine. The doctrine abandoned Soviet control of the communist nations of Eastern Europe, allowing them to make their own governmental decisions. Gorbachev stated that all nations should be free to choose their own course without outside interference. The Sinatra Doctrine led directly to the opening of the Hungarian border, which allowed East Germans to freely travel to Hungary, since it was still an Eastern Bloc nation, and then escaped to the West. East German efforts were futile to stop the thousands leaving for Hungary every day. In 1989, communist regiments fell in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Opposition to Soviet rule was quickly spreading throughout Eastern Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall happened very suddenly on November 9, 1989. An announcement made by East German government official Günther Schabowski was given stating that permanent relocations can be done through all border checkpoints between the GDR, East Germany, into the FRG, West Germany, or West Berlin. People were shocked and wondered if the wall was really open. East and West Germans hesitantly approached the wall, which was indeed now open for crossing. In an act of victory over years of oppression, East and West Germans began to tear and kick down the wall that had separated them for 28 years. But now, after years of separation, the two sides realized how different their cultures really were. Consumer culture was practically non-existent in East Germany during the reign of the USSR. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, East Germans were exposed to exotic items and consumer goods from the West. Some East Germans had never seen a banana, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, items seemingly commonplace to West Germans, such as bananas and disposable diapers, were almost completely sold out. The two sides also differed politically, with such geographic political variations still present. Even today, voting differences between East and West Germans have been noted, that after 40 years under a one-party system, East Germans are recorded as being less likely to vote along party lines, and instead analyze individual candidates. West Germans, however, didn't have a developed party identification. Like giant dominoes, 8-foot-tall foam rectangles decorated with a graffiti copied from the Berlin Wall stood lined up along the wall's original route through Berlin. The date was November 9th, 2009, 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall and its aftermath vastly changed not only Germany, but the world. At the time of the wall's collapse in 1989, East Germany had a failing infrastructure. East German workers tended to be less than half as productive as workers in the West, and much of the country lived in relative poverty. The process of incorporating the two halves of Germany ultimately cost between $1.5 trillion and $2.5 trillion, with many East Germans struggling to make a living on their meager pre-reunion salaries in a suddenly wealthy country. On a global scale, the Berlin Wall represented the rise and fall of Cold War tensions. This easing of tension between communism and democracy, manifested in the wall's collapse, prompted a change in international political alignment. Not only did the fall of the wall act as a precursor to the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later, but gave the U.S. and other ardent anti-communist superpowers the confidence to end relations with anti-communist regimens with histories of civil rights abuses. Such phenomena can be witnessed in the sudden pressure the U.S. put upon former Cold War ally South Africa to end apartheid, only 2 months after the wall's collapse. On November 9, 2009, the giant dominoes fell, as the massive wall in their place had fallen 20 years before. As a reunited and economically and culturally prosperous Germany celebrated, the political repercussions of the Berlin Wall's rise and fall could still be felt throughout the world.